This lecture is on Erik Erikson, and his theory is the psychosocial theory of development. And I'd like to give you a little bit of history. Um, when I was at Princeton Seminary studying cross-cultural religions, the history of religions, um, I was also drawn to pastoral psychology, pastoral counseling. There was a man there, a professor named Donald Capps, and so I started taking his classes, and that's really how um, I continued my interest in psychology and counseling. And um, it was always kind of like an interest of mine. In undergrad, I was uh, English lit major and a psych minor just because I found it so interesting. And um, then at seminary, I was studying religion, um, and my minor was pastoral care and counseling, and so it was kind of always on the back burner uh, until I went back to school again um, and really got more involved in clinical mental health counseling and school counseling. But I can tell you that so Donald Capps studied and then worked with Erik Erikson, and we were able to meet a couple members of his family. And unfortunately, Erik Erikson had already, uh, he was extremely elderly. And see, I graduated in 1990 from seminary, and he passed away in 1994. So I was not able to meet him, unfortunately, but it was very interesting hearing stories and uh, getting to know about him a little better. And uh, I think, and then we wrote a number of articles together, Donald Capps and me, Don, and he always incorporated uh, Erikson's theories in his writings. So, um, the another interesting thing is I mentioned Erikson in my lecture on Freud, and of course he worked with Freud, and um, he wanted to add to Freud's theory, but Freud would not have it. But Erikson's theory is a much more comprehensive theory that is still pertinent in many ways today. Let's look at a little history about uh, Erikson himself. And his whole name was Erich Homburger Erikson. And there's an interesting history about that name as well. But he was born near Frankfurt, Germany, to Danish parents. His parents separated before he was born, and his mother moved to Karlsruhe, Germany. So at the age of 3, Erikson became very ill. Now, this is an interesting theme with our foundational theorists. Many of them became very ill at a young age. Of course, they didn't have antibiotics uh, until just a little later. And there were a lot of life-threatening diseases. And either a lot of our theorists became ill at a young age, and uh, or um, or one of their siblings became ill. I think this is an interesting theme because it gives them a different sense of mortality at a very young age when normally children do not think about these existential uh, questions. But it kind of makes people look at life a little differently. Um, so at 3, he became ill, and uh, his mother took him to a physician uh, who treated him and was successful. He became healthy again, but his mother later married that same physician. His name was Theodore Hamburger. He adopted Erikson and hid the adoption from him for many years. He was so young, he didn't remember it a lot. Um, Ironically, Erikson later coined the phrase identity crisis, and having experienced his own to some degree. Now, when he later became an American citizen, he took the name Eric Hamburger Erikson. So, as a youth, Erikson was shunned by his German peers because he was Jewish, and he was shunned by his Jewish peers because he was tall and blond with Aryan features. So he never really felt truly accepted by his peers. Now, at one point, he converted to Christianity. Um, Erikson did not go to college, but instead wandered through Europe and briefly studied at two art schools. And I believe in the film that you're going to get to watch, they'll share some of his art, but he used art and visuals, the concepts and metaphors throughout his theory and books. Erikson did not go to college, but uh, he was invited by a friend, Peter Blos, B-L-O-S, to come to a school in Vienna where he could paint portraits of the children at the school and serve as his temporary replacement. Now, of course, we know that Vienna and the University of Vienna and the medical school there was really just this hub of psychology with Freud and his mentors. And so many of these children at the school and their parents happened to be in analysis with Freud or his daughter Anna. Erikson had never felt comfortable in a rigid classroom environment, and with Blos, he created a non-graded school that allowed children to have optimum freedom in their learning experience. He incorporated Montessori philosophy in the curriculum. Erikson studied with Freud, Sigmund Freud, and Anna Freud extensively, but later they parted company and in favor of his own theory of psychosocial development. And if you remember, Freud's theory is psychosexual developmental theory. And so it really contrasts these various concepts. Um, and Freud did not want to incorporate Erikson's concepts into his theory. I've I've really liked Erikson's concept of education, and I personally use one called mastery learning. I believe that all students, especially in fields like counseling, should have a mastery of the basic concepts or knowledge that they need to move into practicum and field education. So, rather than using a bell curve and having 70% of my students pass or 30% get a B or something like that, I would rather all of my students master the basic concepts needed to best meet the needs of their clients. So, you know, most of my classes are taught just a little differently. Um, so Erikson left Germany due to his Jewish heritage and moved to Boston, where he was the city's first psychoanalyst. 1933, he accepted a position at Yale, taught at the medical school, and once again, did not get a college degree. Now, one interesting thing is that Erikson always included his wife and gave her credit for her contributions. So, for instance, she came up with the concept of social interaction in life becoming a tapestry, like a woven tapestry. And if you look really close, all you see is the individual stitches or the individual interactions, the cultural and relationships, and all of those interactions. But when you step back, you see this picture come into focus rather than just the individual threads. You see the bigger picture of a complete life and all of the interactions and the whole person, that all of those individual interactions created. So Erikson was also pretty multicultural. I mean, Carol Gilligan criticized him quite a bit. But 2020 hindsight is pretty easy. So it's easy to look back and criticize early theorists for maybe not being as feminist or as inclusive as they should. But for his time period, he was very multicultural and phenomenological. He believed that development must be understood in relation to one's own culture. And in 1938, he studied Sioux Indian child rearing practices in South Dakota. And he emphasized the importance of child rearing events in uh, individuals' developmental processes. So even though, no, he wasn't perfect, but hey, for the 1930s, I think he was ahead of his time multiculturally. Uh, in 1939, he moved to California, where he was associated with the Institute of Child Welfare at the University of California. And he later worked at the Austin Riggs Center in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, Harvard University, and established the Erikson Center in Cambridge, never receiving a college degree. So that's a little bit of history, and they'll probably give you some more history um, in the video that I posted. But let's talk about his theory. And the first thing I'd like to do is kind of compare and contrast his theory with Freud's just a little bit. I'm going to ask you to do this as well uh, in your discussion post, but don't just copy what I said. Compare and contrast it for yourself. Basically, I'm giving you the broad theory contrasts, but I'd like you to look at the stages and the differences between the stages with some examples. So, first of all, he emphasized the role of experiences, both unconscious and conscious, where Freud was more unconscious. Uh, Erikson stressed stages based on psychosocial development, whereas Freud was more psychosexual. Each stage of Erikson's theory has an emotional polarity or a conflict that the individual has to resolve. And it's interesting that Erikson said, well, even if somebody doesn't resolve it uh, at a young age, they can always go back and resolve it at a later age. And I thought that was pretty positive. The first 5 stages parallel Freud's to some degree, other than the focus, of course. And but Erikson did not want to stop the stages at puberty or 12 or 13 years old. he wanted to carry the stages of development throughout the lifespan. He believed in lifelong learning and growth until death, from birth till death. And so he added 3 more stages. And then another person, which we'll talk about later, Levinson, he even added more stages to those later years of development. So his was one of the only major theories of human development to include the entire lifespan at that early time period. So his was also the first theory to stress the role of society and social interaction and the individual in development rather than just a parent's role or guardian's role. And the ego not only mediates but also acts as a positive force in one's development. So it becomes reciprocal and interactive to quite a degree. When he talks about the role of socialization, he sees that as the process of learning socially acceptable behaviors. The concept of psychosocial is the role of social focus on human development throughout the lifespan. So I would even say it was psycho, one's mind and thinking, social, uh, with one's interactions with others. And then they come together, they influence each other. He has 8 psychosocial stages, and defined by that conflict that has to be resolved satisfactorily in order for healthy development to occur. He named them in a series of alternative basic attitudes, which can result depending on the resolution. So let's see. Let's look at the different stages. So the first stage in Freud's would be oral, and that's 0 to 1. In Erikson, it's basic trust versus mistrust. In Freud, the second stage would be anal. Second stage in Erikson, 1 to 3, autonomy versus shame and doubt. Third stage for Freud, phallic, and 3 to 6, initiative versus guilt for Erikson. And of course, there's probably a chart comparing these in your book, hopefully, but it is in the notes just in case it's not in your book. Latency, industry versus inferiority, 6 to 11, genital, identity versus identity diffusion, it's adolescence. And then the 3 additional stages that he added on were intimacy versus isolation, that's young adulthood, generativity versus stagnation, it's middle adulthood, and ego integrity versus despair, that's late adulthood. And all of these are in your notes. So let's talk a little bit about each stage. So the first one, basic trust versus mistrust. And I really think that he laid down a lot of the foundational theory here for Bowlby's attachment theory, which we'll talk about next week. So if you think about it, it's based on a child's early needs and the quality of the caregiver's behavior. When we think about trust versus mistrust, well, think about those early Maslow hierarchy of needs. They have to feel safe, they have to feel loved and secure, they have to have their basic needs met, they have to have shelter and clothing and food, and but it's really that bonding that builds the trust. Yes, they have to be cared for and nourished and kept safe, but also they have to have that nurturing. They have to have that love and care that builds that trusting bond. And I think we'll talk about attachment theory next week. And, reactive attachment disorder, which comes later, and all of this. But I think, you know, attachment and reactive attachment disorder is really based in that basic trust versus mistrust. We'll get into that a little deeper next week. But it's this balance of care and love. And I just remember seeing like uh, all of those um, early videos with the baby monkeys, the Reese's monkeys, and one was placed on a uh, fur uh, kind of like a wire with fur on it, and they would cling to the fur, but another had just plain wire mother, but it had nourishment, and they wanted to feel. Uh, they would cling to the fur surrogate, and yes, they would run over and they would get the nourishment, but the love or feeling as though they were with a mother was more important than the nourishment. And I've just found those experiments pretty sad, but you know, um, and so, you know, an infant has to uh, allow themselves to become vulnerable in order to trust and love. And if they're not getting these basic needs met, they will not allow themselves to become vulnerable, and they will feel as though they need to fend for themselves in an untrustworthy world. Second stage, 1 to 3, autonomy versus shame and doubt. So, this whole concept of shame and a shame culture, which is Native American, versus a guilt culture, which is more European, but autonomy. So this is a time of the toilet training and wanting to do many things in the world on their own, and parents have to provide suitable guidance and positive reinforcement so that the children can become independent. So even though they will, um, want to be around their caregiver, they have that attachment, they'll want to try things on their own as well. And but if they are unable to do this, they might experience shame or doubt um, later on. Okay, and the third stage, age 3 to 6, initiative versus guilt. And Erikson saw early childhood, in his words, as a vigorous unfolding. I remember having puppies with my dog, or kittens, and I would lift up the new puppy or the baby kitten, and I would just think they are a brand new creation. The entire world is new to them, and it will unfold vigorously before them. This will be a grand adventure for them. So this has to do with independence and separation, and a positive setting helps the child to be more relaxed in experiencing new things. Initiative can mean spirited, enterprising, ambitious. Children want to explore new things and try new things. And play helps them to do this. Make believe helps them to do this. Industry versus inferiority, age 6 to 11. I remember being in German class, learning German in high school, and I was not the best student, but I've improved over the years. And my German teacher, of course, I had a German name, Wilhelm, and my German teacher, whenever I actually did my homework and handed it in on time, my German teacher would say, "Ach, Willi fleißig." And of course, fleißig means industrious. And that's kind of what Erikson, the language, is kind of referring to. Industry, industrious, means to develop one's own gifts and useful skills. And this is a time when children begin formal schooling and develop a self-concept and hopefully a pride in doing things well, morality, cooperation. Uh, if they fail at this, they may feel inferior. And we know that Adler also talks about the inferiority that people experience sometimes. So the next stage is identity versus identity diffusion, and this is in adolescence. And we know that he coined the phrase identity crisis uh, to begin to develop a sense of who we are through questioning and exploration. And I think most teenagers have a little bit of an identity crisis, some more than others. They develop peer groups or try different cliques or, you know, different hobbies or sports or trying to find what they're good at or interested in, what makes them happy, what gives them meaning. A negative result would lead to shallowness and a lack of direction in life. So lots of cultures have rituals throughout people's lives, cultural rituals, and it's almost they move from childhood to adulthood at some point. And there's usually a ritual. In our own culture, we don't have as many of those rituals, but could be driving a car, could be getting married, getting a job, graduating from high school, maybe graduating from college. We have a lot of um, achievements, but there's no one thing other than getting married uh, that says you're an adult now. We can say, oh, okay, you can vote or you can drink, 18, 21, or you might be drafted. Um, so those are the closest things, age 18, age 21, or, starting your own relationship. The next stage is intimacy versus isolation, marriage or some form of serious commitment versus loneliness and some self-absorption. It's more about the capacity to love other and to bond with other. It goes all the way back to that attachment, the ability to love beyond self and form those attachments as an adult. The next one is generativity versus stagnation, middle adulthood. This is when people are supposed to be nurturing and teaching others and taking on more responsibilities in work or the community. Ego integrity versus despair, late adulthood. Uh, this is when people begin to do a life review and they reminisce about their life. And it seems as though they either have a feeling of peace and satisfaction or regret later in life. I teach a course on grief, loss, death, anxiety, and this is something we talk about. And we talk about how to counsel and work with people if they have regrets and are not experiencing peace about life, death, things like that, grief, loss. So that's the basics of Erikson, and I will be interested to hear what some of your thoughts are on that.